to hear the case of the people versus Drusus. The defendant is charged with desertion of his regular military service and being party to a body snatching. These are two most serious crimes. Defence, how does he plead?
Not guilty, Your Honour, on both charges.
Very well then. We will proceed. Will the prosecution outline their case?
It is my job, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to stand here before you and to prove that this man, Drusus, a respected centurion of the Roman occupation army in Jerusalem, did desert from his assigned duty. In doing so, he left his fellow soldiers without a leader, and we must be thankful that Drusus's trustworthy lieutenant was able to assume the mantle of responsibility. Not only did Drusus forsake the army that has looked after him since he reached the age of maturity, but he also stands accused of involvement in a heinous plot to make the governing powers look foolish by stealing the body of a crucified man, when at the time he should have been engaged in his duty guarding the body to stop such an occurrence from happening. When I say governing powers, I include, of course, His Excellency Pontius Pilate, Roman governor in Jerusalem, and Drusus's own senior commanding officer. But let me enlighten you, members of the jury. The body that was stolen was that of Jesus ben Joseph, a wandering preacher, who originally hailed from Nazareth, a small village about 60 miles north of Jerusalem. Many strange occurrences had surrounded this man's ministry, tales of healing the sick and even raising the dead. But this man was condemned to death following a number of civil disturbances prior to Passover in the city of Jerusalem. The crime was perpetrated on the morning following Passover, his crucifixion having been carried out the day before Passover. In his teachings, he foretold that he would die, and that after 3 days he would rise again. In order that his prophecy might be seen to be fulfilled, his followers, including the now deserted Drusus, opened the tomb in which the body lay and removed it, claiming that it had risen. His motive for these criminal acts remain a mystery, but his guilt is without doubt.
Will the defence please outline their case?
The man you see before you is a much-travelled, one might say seasoned soldier. He has seen many battles and won many honours. To the men he led, he was a hero, commanding their respect, obedience and loyalty. 3 qualities returned by him. He was destined to go far in his career. Indeed, promotion was imminent, coming at the end of this tour of duty in the city of Jerusalem. So why did he take the actions he did? This council does not seek to deny the facts of the case. It is agreed that on a cold spring night, the defendant did leave his post in a small garden near Golgotha. However, he pleads that he did not desert, as has been asserted by my honourable friend. Drusus resigned his commission in the army, albeit in a somewhat unorthodox manner.
I'm sorry, Your Honour, but I feel I must protest at this. Surely the defence is now trying to attest the man's innocence through semantics.
If I may finish my point and reasoning, all will, I hope, become much clearer.
You may continue, but I must admit, my immediate view is similar to that of the prosecution.
Thank you, Your Honour. I intend to show that Drusus left the army after undergoing a transformation. For you see, the body was not snatched. It rose, and Drusus was there to see it walk.
I object, madam. We are all people of learning, and we all know that men do not rise from the dead, and they certainly do not go for a stroll afterwards.
Your Honour, my client maintains that the body did rise from the burial place. After having witnessed this miracle, he at once decided to leave the army and follow in the footsteps of the risen Messiah.
Ladies, you may both have your say and plead your cases. We listen to the testimonies of witnesses and then we decide on the validity of the defence argument. Defence counsel, will you call your first witness, please?
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Simon Peter to the stand.
Early in his ministry, I don't think he'd actually been travelling for very long. Jesus gathered a group of us about him. My brother Andrew and I received our calling whilst we were practising our trade, that is to say, fishing. One day we were out fishing in the Sea of Galilee. It had been a particularly uneventful day, but we'd managed to catch a reasonable number of fish, certainly sufficient to feed the two of us and our families. We were preparing to land, and as we did, we saw a man. He was sat at the edge of the water and looked at me as if he was just passing the time of day, watching the boats come in. We thought he was just another stranger, a traveller resting in our village, Capernaum. But strangers possess a distance. They do not look at you as fellow fishermen might. But this man showed only love in his eyes, not the all-consuming love of a bride on a wedding day, or the savage lust of lovers. No, this was the love between deep friends, people who understand each other's feelings and care. This man loved all men. It was Andrew who first noticed it. He was younger than me by some years and had a fiery temper which could flare up without warning. Many times we rowed because the nets were too full or caught, and he would get angry. And he felt that everyone on the boat should do their best. This day, however, he just got out of the boat when we beached and walked over to the man and sat down. I was amazed. I pulled the boat up as best I could on my own and then walked over to gently bend his ear on the subject. When I got over to him, he was in deep conversation with the stranger, who broke off and turned to me and asked me to sit and talk for a while. I sat and we talked until well into the afternoon. Then Jesus said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." I look back on it now, and it still never ceases to amaze me that we stood up and left the boat and went to follow Jesus. For the next 3 years, we followed him. We were by his side on the day 6 days before Passover. He entered Jerusalem. He entered this great city on a colt. A colt, the most lowly beast of burden. He entered a conquering hero because he had won the battle of the hearts of the people. They loved him. They tore down palm leaves and took off their cloaks and laid them down before the beast, that they might ease his ride. And they sung praises to God, thanking him for sending Jesus to spread the word. And Jesus rode on. He acknowledged all of them. They were given a touch of his smile, a touch of his hand. Many simply knelt and prayed by the roadside. Maybe they knew what was going to happen. Jesus knew. Of course, it was inevitable. Once we arrived in the city, we went straight away to the temple. Jesus stood in the entrance arch and watched what was going on. Moneylenders charging extortionate rates of interest, vendors selling second-rate animals, disabled and runts as sacrificial creatures. But worst of all, the infamous temple girls. They had turned the temple dedicated to the praise of God into a brothel. He overturned the tables, sending coins and deformed birds scattering. He ran through the temple's courtyard, evicting all those who turned it into a cheap marketplace. I am well built and fear little, but the look on his face that day terrified me. He stood on the steps and cried to those around him, "My Father's house is the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." From that moment on, I knew he was doomed to die. For the next few days, we would accompany Jesus to the temple, where he would sit reading from the scriptures and teach. Sometimes other teachers would arrive and sit and listen and marvel at the wisdom of this oracle. They were shocked that a man of such tender years, who was still only in his early 30s, could speak with such skill. Often the scribes and the Pharisees would arrive. They were the bane of those days. They would ask difficult questions in the hope of tricking Jesus into giving a treasonable or blasphemous answer. I thought they were just hoping to throw him out of the temple. I later realized the full meaning of their actions. Judas ran with us, but he could not bear the guilt on his conscience. He cried like a child and scattered the coins with which he had been paid. Jesus taught us to forgive, and we tried to help him, but he was not strong enough to forgive himself. He hung himself soon after. I, for my part, denied knowledge of Jesus as he approached, stopping only when I heard the cock crow in the early hours of the next day. Then I too fell and wept like a child.
Simon,
My name is now Simon Peter, the name Jesus gave me.
As you wish. Simon Peter, you are or were a fisherman?
That is correct.
And yet you stand here and speak like an orator.
My words come from God.
Do you recognise anyone in this court?
I do.
Would you point them out to us, please?
I recognise Drusus. He was the centurion present when Jesus was arrested. He is now, or was before his arrest, a fellow apostle of the risen Lord.
I see. Arrest precludes his being an apostle, does it?
I never said that.
Do you run away every time one of your group is arrested?
I no longer need to run away, and I have been arrested myself.
You are a convicted criminal yourself, then?
I have been jailed, yes.
And this risen Christ has never come to help you?
He is with me, always.
But he's never helped you escape?
No.
Isn't this odd? You working so hard for him, and he just leaves you to rot in prison?
Sometimes he sends his angels to help me.
Angels? Well, first we have the dead getting up and going for a stroll, and now we have angels. With wings, of course. Oh.
Objection. My witness is being derided.
Upheld. Kindly watch your tone.
Your Honour. So, from what you have said, you are helped by angels sent by a man who has risen from the dead.
One man. The man. Jesus.
Thank you. No more questions.
Simon Peter, what did Drusus say when he came to you?
He said he had seen our Lord walk from the tomb.
That is to say, Jesus.
Yes, and that he truly believed he was the Son of God.
And this is the message you are labouring to spread.
Yes, and to spread his peace.
Thank you, Simon Peter. That will be all.
Prosecution counsel, will you call your first witness, please?
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Caiaphas to the stand.
I am Caiaphas, chief priest of the Temple of Jerusalem. I remember Jesus ben Joseph. I remember when he was first brought to the city to be presented to God as the firstborn son of the family, as the tradition. On his last day in the city, he was slipping away from the parents and made his way to the temple. Found himself a nice little spot, sat down and started listening to the scribes and teachers talk about the scriptures. And then he joined in. A 12-year-old boy, only just presented to God, talking about the Holy Scriptures. Well, on the third day, there was an almighty row. His parents had come looking for him. They had travelled a day away from the city before they'd even noticed that he was absent. I was a young priest at the time, brought in to help look for the child. The parents talked of a child lost and alone in the city. Not this youth with the wisdom of Solomon. He spoke brilliantly about the Torah, and he showed great understanding of the Psalms and his knowledge of history. Well, when his parents finally found him in his usual spot outside the temple, there was not the usual screaming and shouting and cursing one would normally expect. I was there when they were reunited. They simply walked up to him, asked him to return with them back home. He got up, said goodbye to those he was speaking to, and left. No recriminations. His father did say, as they were going, "I'm glad you're safe. Your mother and I were worried." I thought then we'd meet again, and we did. I started hearing tales of his actions and those of his disciples, openly flouting the Sabbath law by calling him the Christ, the Messiah. More and more people were going along to hear him. And then he entered Jerusalem like a triumphant king. Well, he was becoming a nuisance. He cost us revenue by throwing the traders out of the temple. He was getting too big for his boots. We asked him certain delicate matters. And he called us hypocrites. Us, the Pharisees, the upholders of the faith. He even started to turn some of our own people against us. All in the matter of a few days. We knew then that we'd have to have him arrested. On civil disturbance matters, the temple being the main one. I paid one of his followers to lead us to him and sent some temple guards and some soldiers to collect him. He was brought before the Sanhedrin, the great council, and we asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Christ?" But he refused to answer. We had other people testifying that he had threatened to destroy the temple, our beautiful place of worship, and he would destroy it. We then asked him if he was the Son of God, to which he replied, "I am." I was furious at this blasphemy. I even tore some of my own clothes. Imagine the gall of the man to say that he is the Son of God. I knew then that he'd have to die. He'd have to be put to death. We sent him to the Roman governor, Pilate. But he found that he was a Galilean and sent him on to Herod for some courteous matter or other. Well, Jesus wouldn't perform one of his miracles for Herod, for which he would have set him free. Herod got bored and sent him back to Pilate.
Caiaphas, would it be fair to say that you are a strictly practicing Jew?
Oh, the strictest. Pray regularly, I fast regularly, I give alms more often than most of my religion.
But did not Jesus make swinging attacks on this sort of behaviour, calling it overt and hypocritical, and not in keeping with God's true meaning of humility?
And where does it say that in here? Where does it say that?
And is it true that your grievance against Jesus stemmed from the rout of the traders at the temple? An action which cost you and some of your colleagues a nice little income.
It is not the witness who is on trial.
Upheld. Please alter the course of your questioning.
Yes, Your Honour. Caiaphas, what time did the trial before the Sanhedrin take place, approximately?
About 10:30 in the evening.
Obviously, that was not an unusual time for the Sanhedrin to be in session.
On the contrary, it's quite an extraordinary time for one of our meetings. Most of our members had to be brought from their beds.
Was that particularly unusual?
Very unusual, but the members knew that it was something they had to do.
And the witnesses also, presumably.
Sorry?
The witnesses also knew they may be called from their beds.
No, the witnesses were with me.
Witnesses in an important trial? trial being buttered up by the prosecution.
Objection.
Overruled.
Not buttered up, as you say. I merely entertained them until the trial.
You were so certain of an arrest that you retained the services of your witnesses?
Yes.
And did you entertain these witnesses with alcohol?
Objection. How these people were entertained is of no consequence.
Oh, but it is. These were important witnesses in a trial where a man would be sentenced to death. Did you ply them with alcohol?
Yes.
And having so plied, did you have to remind them of their testimony?
Objection.
Your Honour, what we are discussing here is the fixing of the trial, which led indirectly to this trial. I am trying to discern whether or not that trial was fixed.
Objection overruled.
I'll return to the question. Did you have to remind them of their testimony?
The alcohol had gone to their mind. They were getting a little confused. We had to help them.
I put it to you that these people bore false witness. Is that true?
Yes, but it was for the good of Israel.
No more questions.
The witness who claimed that Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple, was he reminded?
No, there was no need. Many of us had heard Jesus say that.
Caiaphas, how do you know that this Jesus was not the true Messiah?
It is written that when the true Messiah comes, there will be no question. Everyone will know that he is the true Messiah.
So you infer that this Jesus was not the true Messiah?
He was not.
Prosecution, call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Pontius Pilate to the stand.
Yes, at the time, I was the governor of Judea, the region where Jerusalem is situated. I don't know why I was sent there. Perhaps I offended someone or didn't give them high enough place at the table. Or maybe I didn't give sufficiently good gifts to the emperor. He was always a bit touchy about his gifts. One of my fellows must have really offended the emperor, for he is now governor of the Britons. But I am rambling. Or am I? For I often wonder whether the governorship of that northern province might have been more acceptable, even with its winds and constant rain. I am a handyman. Naturally, I am a Roman, but life had never prepared me for a tour of duty such as this. Every few days a new Messiah and a bevy of followers. For the most part, Jesus fitted the mould. However, in certain ways, he was very different, for he gave signs indicating that he knew his eventual fate. My wife saw this first. She had a dream in which she met a man from Galilee. I don't know how she knew he was from Galilee, perhaps from his accent. She was fascinated by the man. He had an amazing look in his eyes, a sad, yet haunting look, as though he was resigned to his fate. Then my wife said that faces started to appear around the man. Angry faces, shouting faces, all hurling abuse at him and clamouring for his death. Then the faces stopped shouting and the man disappeared. The faces then became sad and started laying the blame for the man's disappearance at my feet. They all said that his death was my fault. Naturally, the dream was an omen. When Jesus was brought before me, I immediately recognised that look in his eyes. On hearing he was Galilean, I sent him away to Herod for trial. But Herod, he expects his prophets to act like a performing monkey before his court. Jesus would not rise to it and remained almost silent throughout his time there. Eventually, Herod became frustrated with this refusal to perform and sent him back to me. That man, he's such a childish man, and felt piqued that Jesus would not show him a miracle, whereas he had performed many in front of Herod's subjects, according to the stories that were circulating. When Jesus was sent back to me, it was obvious that he had been abused, whether by Herod or his soldiers on the way back, I know not. So, Jesus was brought before me for a second time, and I endeavoured to discover the reason for him standing before me. It was obvious that the Sanhedrin had got it in for him, as was common parlance at the time, but still I was intrigued. So I asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" He replied, "It is you who says so." Well, I'm not used to that sort of answering, and I got extremely angry, demanding to know what he meant by that comment. And then those priests who had accompanied him started hurling abuse and accusations at him until I called for order. I asked him why he remained silent when so many people had testified so vociferously against him. He stayed silent. What could I do? Well, there is a custom whereby I can release a prisoner to the people on Passover. So I went out to my balcony and I asked the people who they wanted releasing. They called out the name of a popular thug, Barabbas, who had been jailed for murder some months prior. I said, "Would you rather not have this man, Jesus?" But at this, a loud cry went up, "Crucify him!" Well, I was astonished. They were like a pack of baying hounds. I asked the crowd for the reason why I should send this man to his death, but they merely cried all the louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" It is my job to uphold the peace. So I sent Jesus to be beaten and thence to be crucified, according to the wishes of the people. I then called for a bowl of water and washed my hands in front of the chief priests, absolving myself of all blame in the case.
Thank you, Governor Pilate. Did you yourself believe him to be guilty?
I don't honestly understand the Jewish system. They have only one God who is omnipotent and intangible. In Rome, we have many gods. All are visible, or their statues are, and all are or were tangible. So this man's claim to be the Son of God puzzles me somewhat. In Rome, our gods have sons and daughters scattered all over the place. But that is the way Rome is. So no, from the depth of feeling expressed to me by the chief priest Caiaphas and the other people whose advice I have come to expect, no, I would say he wasn't.
That is a very subjective view. Do you not have views of your own?
I am the governor in a very sensitive Roman province. I believe what I am recommended to believe.
You say the crowd called for Barabbas of their own volition.
Yes, that is correct.
Are you sure of that?
I am.
there not have been some people among the crowd urging the others on?
Well, there may have been.
Did you see any?
I wouldn't know what to look for.
How about temple priests?
Well, yes, there may have been a few scattered amongst the crowd.
And this didn't strike you as odd, senior priests among the rabble?
Well,
Let us try another approach. Did all the voices call out equally, at the same volume?
no,
Who called out louder?
I don't know.
Oh, I think you do. Was it temple priests?
Yes, it may have been.
No more questions.
Now then, Governor Pilate, you said that you like to work with public opinion.
Yes, that's right.
Why then would you say the people called for Barabbas to be released?
He was a popular figure, a people's renegade.
But he was a simple common criminal.
Yes,
And the people turned their backs on Jesus and called for his death.
yes,
En masse.
yes.
Well, doesn't this strike you as very odd? The people calling for their own saviour, Messiah and King to be crucified?
Objection. Counsel for the prosecution is putting words into the witness's mouth.
Objection upheld.
Then I shall try a different approach. Do you encounter many religious leaders in your job?
Yes, usually temple priests.
And kings?
Yes, the occasional visiting dignitary.
And do their people accord them due respect?
Of course, it goes with the position.
But the people did not show Jesus any respect.
No, they did not.
Indicating, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that this Jesus was neither King, Saviour, nor Messiah.
Defence counsel, could you call your next witness, please?
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Mary to the stand.
I was standing at the gates of Jerusalem when my son was led out. He'd been cruelly beaten and was bleeding badly. Upon his head there was a loop of thorned branches, which I later discovered was the soldiers' attempt at a crown, whilst they stood and abused him. He fell under the weight of the cross that he was carrying, and on more than one occasion the Roman soldiers had to haul him up from his knees and make him walk on. Eventually, they tired of this and they pulled an innocent bystander out from the crowd. He was Simon, a traveller from Cyrene who'd only stopped to see what the people lining the route were staring at. They pushed him roughly into the middle of the road and ordered him to pick up the cross. He refused. Then his eye met Jesus. He stopped for a moment and bent down, and he picked up that block of wood from Jesus' shoulders and carefully helped him to his feet. He then shouldered that cross itself, and the procession moved on. A group of us, including myself and Magdalene, were standing by the roadside sobbing. Jesus turned to us and to the women standing with us and smiled. He then turned to the opposite side of the road where some Jerusalem women were standing. he looked over at them and cried out, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your own children." And then he went on to explain about the impending doom. Upon reaching the hill at Golgotha, Simon laid down the cross. And the soldiers nailed my son to that cross and stood it up. There he hung, whilst we knelt and prayed nearby. He even refused a drink of drugged wine, preferring to suffer that excruciating pain. At the foot of the cross, the soldiers were casting lots to see who would have his clothing. Oh, they were taunting him, suggesting that he follow his own teaching in saving others by saving himself. They even put a plaque above his head saying, "Here is the King of the Jews." And others mocked him for this as well. At about midday, the sky grew black. It stayed that way for 3 hours. It was almost as if the heavens were angry at the injustice down below. Jesus looked down to where I was standing with John, one of his favourite apostles. He spoke quietly, gently. "Woman, this is your son," he said to me. And to John, "Behold your mother." He then looked up and cried out to his Father in heaven and said, "Why have you forsaken me?" And in a gentle voice, he offered up his spirit to his Father. Then my son died. As the soldiers were removing his body, a man approached me. He introduced himself as Joseph from Arimathea, a counsellor. He offered us a tomb in a garden nearby, saying that he too had followed my son's teachings. He had asked Pilate's permission to remove the body, and this had been granted. So we took his body, we gently wrapped it and laid it to rest. Upon remembering Jesus' words about rising again, Pilate ordered that a guard be placed at the tomb at all times. This made it very difficult for us to go there and pray. That night was the Sabbath. So I went with the disciples to prepare.
Seeing as the defence wishes not to question you, I shall detain you only a short time. You were with your son from the gates of Jerusalem to the tomb?
That is correct.
With a group of other women?
Yes, together with some of the disciples.
You are you not, a country girl?
That is true. I was born in Nazareth, in Galilee, where I married the carpenter.
So what brought you to this great city?
I've been here before, as Caiaphas explained, when Jesus was 12. I was here on this occasion, though, to support my son in his ministry.
Well, surely an odd course of action for a mother. Shouldn't you have been at home with your family?
Jesus called people to him. I was one of those called. My husband understood my reasons for going to Jesus.
But why did you feel at this particular time that you should support him?
He said that he was going to die, but that he would rise again. I felt that he would need my love and support if this was to take place.
You knew that he was going to die?
He said that he was going to die, but that he would rise again.
So you travelled in the knowledge that you might be going to watch your son die?
Yes.
And how do you feel about this on reflection?
Madam, nothing can prepare you for the trauma of watching your own son be tortured and crucified. Jesus warned me that this might happen, but he didn't know. However, he did know that in the event of this taking place, he would conquer death and rise again. Yes, he did. I saw him. I was there.
Defence Counsel, please call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Magdalene to the stand.
Jesus was the first man to really treat me as a human being. Someone with real feelings, fears, and emotions. He taught me there was always somebody who loved me and had always cared for me. Even though I sinned against his word in both word and spirit, God still had a very special place for me. In the same way he cared for other people in our group, a prime example being Matthew, one of Caesar's tax gatherers. Matthew was hated as a traitor for having gone over to serve in the Romans. He cheated everybody, overcharging in order to make a little extra to line his own pockets. Then one day, as he sat at his collecting table at the roadside, along came Jesus. Matthew was invited to join our group. He stood up immediately, with a very strange look in his eyes. He walked away from that table, heavy with the levied coinage, and joined us, leaving all his wealth behind. By forsaking completely his old ways, he found a new faith in God. He could forgive everything. We were an odd bunch following Jesus. There were the fishermen, the tax gatherer, Galileans and Judeans, people from beyond the Jordan, and me. He told me I had a very special place in this group, that I belonged to it, and with it. Even though some of us may have dropped below what may be described as acceptable social standards, taught us to still have faith in ourselves. This faith, he said, could then move us to help others. He taught us to love God and to care about God. No matter how badly we had sinned, God still wanted to forgive us. I thought about those words as I saw him hanging on the cross. He cared so much about other people, he was prepared to sacrifice himself to save our souls. I knelt beside Mary and prayed. And when the end came, we held each other and cried. Not because he was dead, we both believed he would rise again and show himself to us. No, we cried because we could see his face and see his pain. Tears run down his cheeks as he cried out, because he felt he was letting us all down by showing weakness. As we laid him to rest on Friday night, we went back to the upper room. It was a foolish move, really, because there could have been guards out looking for us. After they failed to arrest us on the Friday night, we assumed we would be safe, but we were never sure. Peter had come back. His eyes were swollen from crying, and his clothing was torn and dirty. That night, I held him to comfort him, as a mother holds a weeping child. The next morning, we could hear the sounds from outside as people celebrated the Passover. We could not celebrate. Our original 12 was broken by the death of poor Judas. Over the course of the morning, while we were praying, Peter offered a prayer for his soul. As he did so, some of us started crying again. He was only young and caught up by his own destiny. He could not alter his fate, yet he refused to accept us. That night, as I sat and looked out of the window, I remembered all that we'd been through together. And by morning, I found myself praying again. As the sun came up, I woke Mary, and we hurried down to the tomb to carry out the customary anointing of the body. On the walk down, I asked Mary how we would roll the stone away. She looked at me and replied, "God will do it for us." As we entered the garden, we felt the ground tremble as though there were an earthquake. We hurried to the tomb to see if it suffered any damage. The one thing we both feared was Jesus' body being damaged by falling stones before we could lay it to its final rest. As we got to the tomb, both stopped and stared. The stone had already been rolled away. We went inside to see what was there. A man appeared, dressed in shining white robes. He smiled, and his smile fell on us, calming our fears. Then he spoke. "Do not be afraid. I know you are looking for your crucified master. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said he would. It was an angel, and a emissary sent from God sent to us to pass on the good news. He told us to go back to the others and explain." We got to the upper room and we woke the others. Peter immediately jumped up and ran back down to the tomb of John. When they returned, they were singing the Lord's praises. He had fulfilled his prophecy and risen from the dead. The whole room was filled with the joy of singing, praising the Lord's name. In the middle of this, I quietly slipped away. I walked back down through the garden, sat down near the tomb. I found it hard to believe that Jesus had risen. He had actually conquered death and now stood victorious over it. A shadow covered me. I thought it was the gardener, and strange thoughts entered my head. Perhaps he had moved the body, or possibly seen Roman officers ordered in to remove the body after Pilate decided to take it back to a safer berth. Then he spoke. Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? I replied, Sir, if you have taken his body, please tell me where he is, and I will go and tend to his body. Mary. That one word filled with all the compassion in the world. It was the Lord. He asked me not to touch him, but explains he was waiting to ascend to the Father. He told me to go back to the others and explain what I had seen. On my walk back through the garden, I heard another man's voice call out to me. I turned and saw a man dressed in the garments of a Roman centurion, but he was not as I was used to seeing them. His clothing was not shiny and smart, but filthy, and his eyes were bloodshot and red. He walked over to me, holding out his hands. He was trembling. I took his hands and gathered them to me, holding him, calming him. I recognised him. He'd been around all that week. I had seen him once, a proud Roman officer. Now I was left holding him, as one would hold a weeping child. He'd thrown off his armour and stood before me as an ordinary man. He explained that he wanted to give the rest of his life to serving Jesus. I trusted him and took him back to the upper room to meet the others. We sat down as a group and he explained his story to us.
Magdalene. That is an unusual name. From where is it derived?
I was born and brought up in Magdala, on the banks of the Sea of Galilee.
Could you please tell the court briefly a little about your early life?
Objection. I'm sorry, Your Honour, but I cannot see how the witness's early life can be linked to this case.
Ah, but I think that it can. I think the witness's past has a lot to do with the case.
Very well then. Bearing that in mind, you may put your request, but the point made by the defence will remain in consideration.
Very good, Your Honour. Now, Magdalene, your early life.
I was born and brought up in Magdala. I married when I was still very young. My husband was much older than I. He took me away from Magdala to a village near Nazareth. He died when I was still very young and left me with nothing. I had no money with which to try and find another husband, so I had to fend for myself. In order to get money, I took to walk in the streets, getting some money here, some money there.
So you became a harlot.
I needed money.
That does not answer my question. So I fear I must be blunt on the matter. Are you or were you not a prostitute?
Objection. Counsel for the prosecution is accusing the witness of something that is totally unrelated to this case. Something which has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with what is being tried here.
Your Honour, I feel sure that my point is validated when we consider my learned friend's record of witnesses in this case. So far, we have had a frequently convicted political agitator and the mother of an executed rebel. And now we are presented, ladies and gentlemen, with a common prostitute.
On this point, I must agree with the defence. I personally find the manner in which you are questioning this witness to be totally unethical. Please change your line of questioning now.
Very good, Your Honour. Then perhaps we could discuss another matter. You said that the Roman soldier stood in front of you.
That is correct.
And you felt no fear or animosity towards him? One of the men who had nailed your master to a cross?
Jesus taught us always to forgive, no matter what a person had done. He forgave me for my past.
So you were ready to forgive this man?
Yes, unreservedly.
And you held this man?
Yes, as a mother holds her child. So I held him.
And that is all? You just held him? Objection.
Your objection is valid. I do not like your line of questioning here.
Very well. No more questions.
Prosecution, please call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Lucius to the stand.
I did not remember much of the day in question. However, I would now like to tell the court about those events which have since come back to me. I was second in command to Drusus, in a platoon which had been on duty for almost the whole of that day. The men were longing for a relief from their duties. However, we were so short of soldiers at that time that none could be spared. They just had to keep going until the tense situation existing in Jerusalem at that time had diffused. We were on duty on the Friday at the crucifixions, and we were present when the prisoner named Jesus was executed. We were given the job of taking him down from the cross. We had been hoping to get back to the barracks that night so that the men could get some well-deserved sleep. Men who are asked to stand duty for too long will go into a sort of a downward spiral as their concentration and patience is stretched. A note came from our senior officer at headquarters, ordering our platoon to guard this dead man's tomb. It was a highly irregular request, but it had apparently come from the governor himself. So, Drusus divided the platoon into shifts, to allow some rest while others guarded. He and I then took the first shift, which lasted well into evening. He assigned the two of us to 3 separate shifts over the course of the weekend. I assumed this was to allow the men to get as much rest as possible. I now see this had a much more sinister reason. On the Saturday, I rested, except for a brief spell of duty at the tomb around midday. During this time, I began to notice that Drusus's mood was changing. He was becoming more and more distant, so he had something weighing heavily on his mind. Our last spell of duty was in the small hours of Sunday morning. We went on duty about an hour before sunrise and took up a sentry position by some rocks near to the mouth of the tomb. Drusus sat perfectly silent as if he was waiting. Could not get a single word of conversation out of him. He just sat watching the tomb. So I just sat watching him. Shortly after sunrise, there was a very strange noise, almost like a very low moaning sound. I must admit, I was nervous, and when I looked at Drusus, I could see he was trembling also. Then there was a very strong wind, and it was while this was blowing that I was attacked. Somebody must have used the cover of the noise and the wind to cover their approach. I was struck forcibly on the side of the head, a blow which rendered me unconscious, causing me to fall to the floor. In the act of falling, I grazed the skin on my legs, my hands and my face. They must have struck me quite hard, for they broke the skin, causing me to bleed. And I must have lain on the ground for quite some time. When I came to, I looked around. I checked the tomb. The stone had been rolled away from the mouth of the tomb, and when I looked inside, I could see that the ledge where the body had lain was now bare. Well, it was as I had feared. The body was gone. Somebody had stolen the body. I looked around for Drusus, but could see no sign of him. I checked the bushes around the area, but still could see nothing. I assumed whoever had knocked me out had carried him away with them. So I considered the position. Somebody had knocked me out and carried away the bodies of Drusus and Jesus. Could not see why they should take the bodies of Drusus, though. He was of no real use to them. I checked the place where I'd last seen him, but could see no signs of a scuffle, and there were no tracks in the dirt where they might have carried his body away. Of course, it was then that I realised Drusus had deserted our position. I took up my post again and waited for the relief to arrive. They turned up soon afterwards. I ordered one to wait at the tomb, while the other assisted me back to the barracks. When we arrived, I reported Drusus's desertion to our commanding officer and made a full report of the situation. He commended me for my bravery and made me acting centurion of the platoon, in a position he would confirm later. He then ordered me to go to the medical room to get the wound to my head seen to.
Lucius, you say you were seated at the time of these events at the tomb.
That's correct.
Your medical report states that there was dust found in your cuts, which meant that you must have fallen forward at great speed or with great force. Now, you're not a heavy man. How do you account for that?
Well, they must have occurred as I slid to the ground.
I see. And you also say you were hit on the side of your head.
Yes, I was hit on the side of the head. There's a scar just here to prove it.
But how did your attackers get so close to you as to hit you on the side of the head? I mean, they'd have to get fairly close to get a decent swing at it, which I thought you would have seen using peripheral vision.
The noise of the wind covered their approach. I didn't see them, I have told you that already.
But why hit you on the side of your head, when the back of your head presented a much easier and more visible aim point?
I don't know. I couldn't see inside their heads to tell their motives.
I'm sorry, Your Honour, but I fail to see the logic behind this line of questioning from the defence.
If the court will bear with me a little while longer, I am sure my motives will become perfectly obvious to everyone here.
Very well then, carry on.
Excuse me, Your Honour. Now, Lucius, getting back to this wound of yours. Your medical report states that you were struck just above the ear by a blow emanating from the forward facial direction. Which means you were hit from the front. Now, why didn't you see that?
I must have my eyes closed.
I must have had my eyes closed. Would the court secretary kindly take note of the witness's admission here that he had his eyes closed on duty?
I can't have done. I wouldn't. I'm an officer of the Roman army.
Yes? No? Anything? Then I shall continue to my next point. Your platoon, Lucius, was sent to search the immediate area in front of the tomb, while you were having your wounds tended to. About 400 yards away from the entrance, they found a small area of drying blood. How do you explain that?
Perhaps it was Drusus's blood. Perhaps he had injured himself and they were carrying him away.
Ah, but he wasn't carried away, was he? You have just said he deserted.
Then perhaps he injured himself as he ran away.
This is a possibility. However, Drusus was given a thorough medical examination after his arrest. The report of that examination makes no mention of any recent wounds, cuts or grazes of any shape or form. That was certainly not Drusus's blood.
Then perhaps he cut his foot on the stone.
Ah, well, that is a possibility. There was blood found on the stone, indicating that it was the cause of a wound, and his feet would not have been checked for damage.
Then that must be the case.
How do you know about the stone?
You mentioned it when you talked about the drying blood.
I'm sorry, I made no mention of any stone. Would the court kindly bear me out on this point?
Yes. I have not made any note, any references of stones during the course of your cross-examination.
Lucius, how did you know about the stone?
I don't know.
Then I shall continue. Is it or is it not true that yours is a very proud battalion?
That is true.
Is it also true that following an embarrassing defeat in a campaign some years ago, it became customary for your officers to carry their resignation notes around with them at all times, so that if they should embarrass themselves or the battalion, they could resign their commission instantly?
That is also true.
Drusus says he left this letter when he left his post.
The wind.
What was that, sorry?
The wind.
Under a pile of heavy stones. But since you see fit to return to the subject of the wind, is it or is it not true that the wind could blow away the ashes of a burnt note?
It could.
Did it?
It did.
Could you repeat that for the jury, please?
It did.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, I offer you an alternative version of events in front of the tomb. When this strange happening occurred, both soldiers were struck with fear, Lucius more so, and he ran away. About 400 yards away, he tripped and fell and hit his head on a stone, injuring his body, arms and legs. When he came to, he realised the seriousness of the situation and immediately returned to his post, expecting to find a furious Drusus. When he got there, the place was empty. He did see Drusus's resignation letter, and this gave him the idea of how he could turn this to his advantage. So you see, it was not Drusus who deserted, it was Lucius. And when he returned to the tomb, he realised his reprieve. And so he set about assuring for himself a quick promotion at the expense of the name and reputation of his former superior officer.
Defence Counsel, will you now please call the defendant?
Thank you, Your Honour. I would like to call Drusus to the stand.
Well, it's a week that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. It all started when we were drafted into the city following a request of the priests at the temple. Previously, we were based in Emmaus, about 15 miles west of Jerusalem. I was aware of the arrival of Jesus and his followers to the city gates. I was on guard at the time. We'd been sent in to help clear up at the temple. During the week, we'd walk past the temple, and there'd be huge crowds gathered around where this man was teaching. I was aware of Jesus' arrest. I was the officer in charge of the arresting party. I had to keep control. Not only of my own troops, but also the thugs from the temple that were forcing their way into us. My soldiers had their hands full keeping trouble from these men, let alone dealing with the arrested men and the arrested man and his followers. took Jesus to the temple to appear before the Sanhedrin, and then from there we took him to see Pilate. I was amazed how he was able to stay so calm in the face of such adversity. These men wanted to kill him. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod under my command. He trusted me and he knew I'd get the job done. I hated taking him to Herod. That man was more of a king than Herod would ever be. Herod toyed with him, like a cat toys with a mouse, but he soon got bored when Jesus wouldn't play back. He started hurling all manner of abuse and accusations at him. Then, like a petulant child that didn't want to play anymore, he sent him back to Pilate. Herod was very immature in his manner and his means. I was glad and relieved when we finally left there. So I took him back to Pilate, and he stood trial again. But Pilate didn't want to see this man dead. He just felt he was being victimised by the temple authorities for undermining public confidence. But he went along with their desires as a political act of diplomacy. Jesus had angered the temple authorities, made him furious in his words and his actions. Pilate would rather just have had him flogged to appease them, but they wouldn't hear anything of the sort. And they whipped up a crowd of support calling for Jesus to be crucified. Pilate saw that he was fighting a losing battle, so he condemned him to keep them happy. Jesus was handed back to me for safekeeping. My soldiers and I took him down to the cells where he was placed under guard. But during the night, the sentry were joined by other guards, and they beat and abused him horribly. When I arrived at the cell the next morning, he was in a terrible state. He was led to the place of execution and nailed to the cross, where he hung for about 3 hours. I placed myself on sentry duty at the foot of the cross. I felt I owed it to him for letting my soldiers abuse him. Just before he died, he called out to God. And his words deeply moved me. He called God his Father. And I remember saying to myself, this man truly was the Son of God. I'd been at his arrest, his trial, his sentencing, and now his death. I felt deeply moved. I was grateful to be given the sentry duty at the tomb. It allowed me some time to think. On about our third spell of sentry duty, Lucius and I were sitting out the front, and all of a sudden this wind just come out of nowhere, and I was struck blind, but all of my senses become very active. I could feel things rather than see them. I felt the stone move away from the tomb. I felt the presence pass me as he came out. When my sight returned, sometime later, I stood in shocked disbelief. I ran back to the tomb, my astonishment growing as I realised it was empty. I'd seen Jesus leave it, but not with my eyes. With my feelings. I failed to register Lucius's absence. I felt strange. Overjoyed, really. Jesus' followers said that he would rise, and he did. So intense was my joy that I started to weep. Something I've not done in a long time. Then I took out my resignation. I left it with my sword and my armour at my post. Then I just walked away. I wandered the gardens for some time until I came across a woman of whom I recognised. She too had been at the foot of the cross. I held out my hands to her, and she held me. She took me back to meet the others so that they could explain Jesus' teachings to help me understand what had just gone on. I stayed with them for a few days and then set out with one of them to go back to Emmaus to visit some friends. Along the journey, we come across a man of whom professed to have not heard of any of the going on in Jerusalem. My companion explained it all to him, but he would just cut in from time to time, explaining the week's events relevant to that of the scriptures. As we walked, we went through the early teachings and he expounded upon those which were relevant to the coming of the Messiah. And thus we spent a day's labour. When we reached Emmaus, the man made to move on. But my friend asked him to stay and eat with us, though it would only be a simple meal of bread and wine. But once at the table, the stranger took the bread, blessed it, then broke it. Then he took the wine, and he blessed that. At once we knew we were in the presence of Jesus, but then he vanished. We stood immediately and ran back to Jerusalem. I was near Jesus all through that week. I was there in his final hours. I was there when he rose from the tomb. And I was there when he appeared on the road to Emmaus. I saw him die. And yet I know he's still alive.
Drusus, you were a Roman soldier with a fine reputation for bravery and unequalled record of loyalty.
This is true.
And yet you stand here and tell us that you have seen a dead man rise and walk.
That is so.
Well, surely you can understand my bafflement. I am not a scientist, but I do know that when a person is dead, they tend to remain just that, dead.
And neither am I a man of learning, so I must take your word on this point, though the logic of the argument seems inarguable.
I imagine that you have seen many dead bodies.
Naturally, I was a soldier. I walked many battlefields, hence I've seen many dead bodies. Some of them were in that condition because of me.
And not one of them stood up again?
No. Well, not for long anyway.
I'm sorry, I don't get your meaning.
Any apparent corpse that was seen to move was stabbed to make sure it was properly deceased. Provided it was theirs, of course. Our own men were often taken back for medical attention, but more often than not they went back to being dead as well.
These people were merely unconscious then?
Or in shock, suffering from severe blood loss.
Of course. Then I put it to you that Jesus might only have been unconscious or in shock, and when he recovered in the tomb, he made good his exit.
There's two slight flaws with that argument. The first being, although it's relatively easy for a group of well-built men to move the stone, it's downright awkward for a man suffering severe blood loss to move it. Then there's the mechanics of the crucifixion. The crucified person, the body, the position of the body, it puts extreme force on the chest and abdomen, causing it to collapse, and that causes severe internal bleeding. And there's no way of feigning that. Once a crucified person is dead, they are very dead.
Which Jesus was.
When we took him off of that cross, he was very dead.
I see.
Though what was strange was the look on his face. It was the look of someone considering a job well done.
Yes. To change the subject, didn't you find his followers' immediate acceptance of you very strange?
At first, yes. But then I remembered what they told me about his teachings, and he had taught them to forgive. And they'd forgiven me.
They forgave the man that killed their elder.
Yes.
I am interested in your sudden conversion. One of Lucius's comments has made me think. He referred to the condition of your men as being similar to a downward spiral because of the overwork. Can you be sure that you weren't caught on this downward spiral and clutched at the straw of belief in this man to escape it?
I willingly admit that I was caught up in that situation, but then so were so many others. Magdalene, Matthew, Lazarus. But it wasn't clutching at straws in the belief of escape, more in the belief that Jesus was the upward turn in a downward spiral.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the time has come when we must decide this case, discover for ourselves whether or not the defendant is in fact guilty. You have had all the salient facts laid out before you by our learned counsel, and you have heard the testimonies and answers of the witnesses under cross-examination. If you will remember the first witness, called by the defence, Simon Peter.
A man who openly admitted to having been jailed for causing or inciting civil disturbance and disobedience. It was this man who openly admitted to having been saved by angels sent by a man who had come back from the dead. Surely this must put doubt in your mind about his validity, or possibly his sanity.
After Simon Peter, we heard from Caiaphas, who admitted to applying drink to the witnesses prior to Jesus' trial to the Sanhedrin. It is true that alcohol can relax some, but with others it can lead them into flights of fantasy. Then we heard from the governor of Jerusalem at the time, Pontius Pilate.
And what a wholly ineffectual excuse for a provisional governor he turned out to be. he allowed himself to be bullied and barracked into condemning a man rather than using his own authority and upsetting a group of priests.
Then there was Mary, a tired old lady who had travelled a long way to see her son enter triumphantly into Jerusalem, where he was later executed. You heard these testimonies as a background to the case, allowing you some insight to the feelings and fears that were prevalent in Jerusalem that week. Then there was Magdalene, a former prostitute, who was so ready to forgive her master's executioner that she hugged him when they first met. And then there was Drusus, a man so determined to gain promotion that he was prepared to sacrifice his own commanding officer's reputation in order to gain it.
Considering the evidence of Lucius uncovered during cross-examination by the counsel for the defence, the prosecution is willing to drop the charge of desertion.
We thank counsel for the prosecution for this.
However, there still remains the charge of body snatching. There is no evidence other than the testimony of some of the man's most committed followers that he ever rose and walked from the tomb unaided. I still maintain that the defendant removed the body as a preconceived criminal act. He did this in full knowledge of the possible consequences, which he was prepared to ignore given the possibilities for promoting the cult surrounding this man.
Few have had any proof, but many truly believe that this miracle did take place.
I agree, following the witness's testimony, that the charge of desertion shall be struck from the record and removed. However, as you say, this does leave the question of body snatching. And so, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to make your decision as to whether the defendant is guilty of body snatching. Did the body rise? Did it leave of its own volition? Or did it rise? Or was it removed? And now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is time for you to retire and for you to make your decision.